Hi, everybody. It's really weird to not be able to see everyone because it's like, is it just you and me, Chantelle, or
It,
other people really here? They're coming in. It's 7 o'clock, so 7:01. We're just gonna wait a minute while we get started, but I can actually do the introductions of Chantelle. Chantelle is a lovely, amazing person. I'm gonna read you her formal bio. Hold 1 second. And I've known Chantelle for years, and you guys are in for a real treat. Very, very exciting. So welcome to Beyond the Book, Creating a Writing Career. Chantelle Aimée Osman is the editor of Agora Books, an award-winning imprint focusing on socially and culturally unique crime fiction and horror from publisher Polis Books. Since its founding in 2019, Agora titles have won 3 International Latino Book Award medals, been nominated for Edgar, Dagger, Anthony, Strand Critics, Macavity, and Lefty Awards, and been featured in NPR, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Post, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Chicago Tribune, and Entertainment Weekly. She was named a Publishers Weekly Rising Star honoree in 2020. She is also a professor at the LIU Brooklyn Polk School of Communication, MFA in Writing and Publishing, an instructor at the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, Authors at Large, and Lit Reactor. The former editor-in-chief of RT Book Reviews magazine and a freelance editor for over 10 years, and has been a judge for the Phoenix Film Festival, International Thriller Awards, and the National Association of Hispanic Publications Jose Marti Awards. Chantelle is the author of the nonfiction series on writing, The Quick and Dirty Guides To, which are very fun, I highly recommend, has published numerous works of short fiction, and served as the editor of multiple anthologies, including the upcoming Jewish Noir Volume 2 from PM Press. But most importantly, she hosts the Words of Prey podcast through Pipeline Artist Network. And she's also your wonderful presenter tonight. And I welcome Chantelle, and I will, there's a Q&A box that you should be able to pop questions into. It would be helpful if you wanted to chat amongst yourselves in the chat box, that's cool. But if for the Q&A questions directed for Chantelle, if you can put them in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom bar of your Zoom. On mine, it shows at the bottom right, which is probably where it is for you too. So you can pop that box open and pop your question in there, and Chantelle will be taking them. Do you prefer them along the way, or are you going to address them at the end?
I always think that, what I have in mind to talk about isn't necessarily, the burning questions that the audience has. And I'd rather answer what everybody, wants to know tonight. Think of me as like your publishing Alexa. So please feel free to, put questions in the question box, and I will monitor, keep an eye over there, and hopefully answer them as they come in. Clarifications as well. I tend to talk quickly. So if you guys need me to go through something again, please let me know and I can do it again more slowly.
Okay, so I'm going to back away and I'll keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A in case there's an issue. And if you have an issue or want me to pop back in, just let me know. So enjoy.
Thanks, Jeannie, and thank you, Pipeline. It's really an honor to be the inaugural symposium speaker tonight. And this topic kind of came up as something that Jeannie and I were talking about. As she said, we talk frequently and often about writing. And we found that so many programs or workshops or, panels just deal with finishing your first book. And that's wonderful. And that's really hard. And for those of you who are at that point in your journey, I mean, that is a big deal. So congratulations. But you have to, if you plan on having a career as a writer, you have to think from basically day one, past the end of that first book, and kind of plan your next, let's say, 5 to 10 years as a writer, what you're going to write, what you want your journey to look like, and educating yourself early on about those things makes a big difference, and plotting your career. I've sent a handout, which kind of is a fill in the blank. So hopefully after you listen to this presentation, you'll get from Pipeline the handout, and then you can fill in your journey. So the first step, I think, is diagnosing whether or not your book is actually ready. So what does that mean? Is my book ready? That means, yes, I finished it, because you can't go through the next steps, which are, finding an agent, finding a publisher, until the book is actually done. And I know a lot of people who do NaNoWriMo, which was not that long ago, although it seems like 5 years since November. But they finish the book, they write the end, and then they go, okay, I'm ready to send it out because I wrote the end. But that book isn't quite ready yet. So first of all, I have a little bit of bias. I've been a freelance editor for probably 15 years, if not longer now. And so I think that there's a very good value in hiring a freelance writer or editor to check over, your manuscript, simply because, there are things about your own writing that you will never see. And I'm going to briefly, because I have a lot to go over tonight, I think, and hopefully we'll get a lot of questions as we go along. But I'll give you some diagnostic tools and tricks for doing some self-editing. But going back to the freelance editor thing for a minute, I think it's really a good idea, if you possibly can, to hire that freelance editor to look over before you start the submission process. And basically, a lot of what I'm going to tell you, especially in this first part about submission process, is going to tell you how to get your submission slightly higher up the pile, just by doing a few things that a lot of people don't think about doing, or tips and tricks that just make you stand out a little bit in a good way from the crowd. So things like making sure that you have a really dynamic first page. If you think about it, at the end of the day, a reader, a editor, an agent, they're all love books, and they're looking for the next read that they want to have. And if you go into a bookstore, if you can, if it's safe, the first thing that you're going to look at is the cover of a book. You're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but, unfortunately we do, especially if you're going in there and don't have a specific thing that you're looking for. So you're going to look at the title or the cover or something like that. You're going to pick up the book, you're going to flip the book over, and you're going to read that back cover copy, which we'll get into a little bit later, is basically the mini synopsis in your query letter. And then the last thing you're going to do before you decide if you want this book and you're going to walk out with it or not is probably read the first page or first couple of pages. And honestly, it's that first page or first couple of pages where you are going to hook all of your readers. And again, by reader, I might mean the agent who's reading your manuscript, the editor who's reading your manuscript, or long-term, the reader who's reading that book that's been published. So you really, really have to have a strong first few pages. That's truly key. So having things, and I notice this a lot with new writers, and honestly, I notice it with veteran writers as well. Sometimes, especially if you're not a particularly strong outliner, people work out their characters and their plot a lot through the first chapter of their book. So you're kind of learning your protagonist along with the reader learning the protagonist. And I find that probably the first chapter of a lot of new manuscripts, or the first, shall we say, 15 to 20 pages, can actually be cut, because the action probably starts in that second chapter, where literally the action starts going on and you've figured out who your character is. You've got the inciting incident for the plot, and that really is the better first page than that first page of the first chapter. So that's number one. Have a really, really great, first couple of pages. And I know that this is kind of, I don't want to say cheating, but let's call it cheating. If you do hire that freelance editor, And, sometimes this can be expensive. And another point that I want to make as an aside here, you'll notice I do this a lot when I talk. So it's not really a linear presentation, but I promise we'll get through everything. I used to be a lawyer. And as a lawyer, you have to do things like continuing legal education, take classes to make sure that you're up on, the most, current version of a law or what's going on. And there are other professions, real estate, stockbroker, name it, that this also is true of. As a writer or an agent or an editor, you, fortunately or unfortunately, don't have to do any of this. You don't have to do anything as a writer other than sit in your wherever and write. And I think things like this symposium, I think things like hiring a freelance editor, I think all of these things are kind of part of, let's call it the continuing writer education. And I suggest, even putting a jar on your desk and throwing loose change in there, so that you have a little bit of money, because unfortunately, this quote education that we're getting, whether it's through the symposium or rather through a freelance editor, these things do cost money. And so saving up and pursuing that continuing education, I think, is really one of the keys of a career author. So now going back to, the original point. So hiring a freelance author or editor, you need money to do that. And sometimes it might be cost prohibitive. A lot of these things might be. But one of the workarounds, the cheating, like I was talking about, is most agents and editors will ask for the first 50 pages of your novel or the first 50 or 3 chapters, either or. That's pretty standard. You might get a full request, yay if you do, but otherwise, it's 3 chapters or 50 pages is kind of standard. So guess what? I think that you should have the freelance editor, if you can't afford the whole thing edited, to go over those first 50 pages and make sure they are completely stellar. Get an outside independent viewpoint on those. Make sure there's nothing in there. I mean, hopefully you're not going to get kicked out for a typo, but part of my ethos about submission packages, which is a query letter, a synopsis, and your first 50 pages, is that the only reason that you want to be rejected, and we'll talk about the word rejection in a minute, because that is anathema to me. But if you get rejected, it ought to be simply because an agent or editor or reader, as we will call them all, just didn't passionately connect to your book. And that's the only reason. It shouldn't have a typo. It shouldn't have all of these things. Same is true of your query letter. Same is true of your synopsis. And the thing is that it's not editors like me can be mean. But a lot of the reasons that things get kicked out, or we'll use the anathema word, rejected for another time, has very little to do with the content of what you've actually written. Very rarely is it actually a commentary, that rejection, on whether or not you're a good writer. Agents, editors, and by editors in this case, I'm referring to publishers, not freelance editors, we get submissions that might be 50 to 500 submissions a day. There's literally no way that we have enough time to read all of these submissions and do work on the books that we've already acquired. And so there has to be a reason, some rules that we set in order to get that pile to a manageable number. So some people might say, if there's a typo, I'm kicking it out. If it's over X word count, I'm kicking it out. There have to be these, very objective standards. And you want to make sure that that submission package is going to meet all of those objective standards, and that the only reason that, again, the word rejection, that you're rejected is that it just, didn't stand out as a book for your reader. And since I keep saying it, I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about the word rejection, because I actually don't think I do the pipeline authors chat every Thursday night, which is amazing. And if you haven't joined, I highly recommend that you do. We all talk about our writing journeys, what we've done for the week, what we haven't done, tips and tricks for doing things better. So I highly recommend joining us for our chat on Thursdays. But a topic that comes up quite frequently is being rejected. You submit a short story, you submit an article, you submit a book, and you're rejected. And it feels bad. Of course, it feels bad. None of us like feeling rejected. But a lot of what I talk about tonight and what's going to be in that handout that you fill out is building your team. We think often of writing as a solitary act. Again, we just have to be in a room with a pen or a laptop, and that's all we do. And so you think, well, there's not a lot of, interaction. I'm doing this all myself. But that's really not true. I mean, obviously, there's a bunch of us here tonight listening to this symposium. Like I said, on Thursday nights, a bunch of writers get together and talk. I know Jeannie does one for screenwriting as well. And so it really isn't as solitary an event as you think. And especially once you get to the publication or the agenting part of the process, you really are building your team. If you choose to, as I recommended, get a freelance editor, which you don't have to. And again, I'll go back and do some of those self-diagnostic tips in a minute. But that freelance editor is going to be part of your team. Like I said, I've done it for years, and I have writers who are New York Times bestselling authors, and I look at their books before they even send them to agents, even though they have a contract or something, because I'm part of their team, and I look at that. Your agent is going to be part of your team. You want somebody who is the most passionate representative of your work humanly possible. And the same thing goes for your editor and your publishing house. So, when an agent rejects you, quote unquote, it's really not a horribly bad thing, because what they're just saying is, I am not the most passionate advocate for this. I can, it didn't keep me up all night. And the thing is that you want somebody who just went, I couldn't put this down. That's going to be a better advocate for your work than somebody who goes, I kind of like it, but I guess I can add you to my list. That's not really the person that you want selling that work. You want the person, that reader, again, because at the end of the day, we're all readers. You want that reader who's really going to connect with it and be passionate about it. And think of it this way as well, going back to that bookstore that we hypothetically walked in to look at the covers. When you go in that bookstore and you read the back of the book and you read that first page, and you know what, you're really not connecting with it. You wanted something a little bit more fun. This is too serious, or perhaps the opposite. It's not like you threw that book on the floor and went, this book is terrible. I would never read this book. You just went, this is probably a good book, but it's not right for me, at least not today. And that's what an agent is saying, or an editor in cases of rejection. And you want, it's kind of, honestly, if you think about it, it's a lot like dating. Would you rather end up with the first person that you dated because they went, well, I guess this could work, I'll see. Or do you want to go through, I don't know, 50, 100 bad dates to find that one person who goes, I am really crazy passionate about you, and want to spend the rest of my life with you. So think about that when you're courting an agent or, an editor or publisher. This is all part of building that team. So before I forget, and then I'll jump into the questions, because I know I begged you guys for questions and now I'm completely ignoring them. But before I forget, I want to go into those self-diagnostic things on your first 50 pages or your submission, or is my book ready to be submitted? So again, make sure you're not submitting until it's actually done. There is a small caveat to this, and that is, like, if you're pitching in person, there's a bunch of ways to do that, by the way, which, as another aside, I told you get these from me. you are more likely to land an agent or a publisher in, one in-person pitch than you are in 100 query letters. Doing an in-person pitch, and there's a bunch of wonderful ways to do that. Writers Digest conference in New York, also ITW. There's a lot of conferences, even smaller ones, League of Utah Writers, that bring in agents and editors that you can pitch in person. And so, doing that, well, and virtually, of course, nowadays, but that's a much better way to connect with somebody. So I highly recommend, if you can pitch in person or virtually, doing that. So if you are pitching in person and your book isn't done, please let the agent or publisher know that the minute that you sit down or turn on the Zoom meeting. You can get feedback on your pitch, you can get feedback on your book, and that's perfectly valid. But it is just really a dream killer to us, editors and agents, where we hear a wonderful pitch and then somebody goes, well, I'm not done with it. I might be done in 6 months or a year or whatever. And we were so excited and we couldn't wait to go back, read it tonight. And so that's really disappointing for us. So make sure you're only pitching in those other circumstances if your book is complete. So again, we've talked about doing a freelance editor. We've talked about the importance of a really solid beginning. Make sure that something happens on that first page. The whole a body has to drop in the first couple of pages is kind of a myth, but you still want something that's going to engage the reader immediately. And you can have, especially if you do that freelance edit for the first 50 pages, if you've engaged your reader in the first 50 pages, you can kind of have a soggy middle. Not that any of you will, because you all have written brilliant books, but somebody's going to stick with you through that soggy middle and go, oh, I have ideas to fix that, as long as, and here's the last caveat, you stick the ending. I used to work in Hollywood, and if I did one test screening, I did 1,000 test screenings. And I loved how you'd have people who just love a movie. And they, it's the best movie they've ever seen. They can't wait to buy it. They can't wait to see it again. They can't wait to blah, blah. And then the last 10 minutes is somehow unsatisfying, or doesn't close a circle, or there's a thread that's dropped or something. And suddenly, even though they enjoyed it for 85 out of the 90 minutes, they go, no, this is the worst movie I've ever seen. I will tell everybody not to see it. And unfortunately, in film and plays, I suppose, but also in publishing and literature, this is really the only time that happens with a creative endeavor. It's not like, you don't go to a restaurant and have a wonderful meal and then order dessert, and the dessert is, less than stellar. And suddenly you flip over the table and go, I will never darken the door of this restaurant again. In fact, you're probably going to come back. You just might order a different dessert or not order dessert next time. But there's just so much emotion tied up in that ending in a movie or a book. So you've really got to make sure that you've got that really strong first few chapters and a really strong, solid ending. And last tip, as far as self-diagnosis for, is your book ready? You can probably tell anyway, but I've always been a nerd, and one of my favorite things was back to school shopping. I loved buying, folders and notebooks and pens and everything. So any excuse that I have to do any of those things right now, I will take. But I highly recommend actually printing out your book. I'm really sorry, trees. Try not to do it too often, just, once in the book process. And buy a pack of highlighters and assign a color to each thing in your book. So like dialogue is blue, and adjectives and adverbs or descriptors are pink, and, prose is green. And, anything else, especially if you know that you tend to do something, assign a color to it. And then highlight those and see what's in your book. Like, you should have a lot of that blue dialogue. What you shouldn't have, is a lot of the pink descriptors. If there's more than 2 or 3 in a row, you can probably tighten that up. Same thing about prose. If you've got a page or most of the page of, that green prose, you probably want to break that up with some dialogue or something, because just as an aside, readers, psychological studies have said never skip dialogue, or very rarely skip dialogue, but they will skip a big chunk of prose. So seeing that and seeing, where you can improve, and using the highlighters kind of uses a different part of your brain. Another suggestion would be reading something aloud, because that also uses a different part of your brain than the writing process does. And it's amazing how, you won't catch an echo or a repeat or dialogue that sounds stilted when you're reading it. But if you say it out loud and then you go, oh my God, I wrote that, nobody would ever say something like that. So those are a few diagnostic tools for the, is my book ready portion of your career path before we move along. So before I go into the next part of this, I am going to address the fabulous questions in the Q&A box. So the first question is, Kenna's book is a nonfiction on women's health. She chose to self-publish, and it really opened doors in her career. She's recording an audiobook version now and want to use this opportunity as a relaunch. I would appreciate your suggestions. I think that's wonderful. And honestly, I'm not going to cover a lot of self-publishing things in this talk, because I suppose they've brought me on to represent traditional publishing. But I have to say, applause to anybody who does self-publish. And a couple of side notes. Yes, I will address your question, but I told you I go on tangents. So here comes a tangent on self-publishing. I think it's really, really hard to do. I am really at heart a lazy person, and so I don't think I would do very well self-publishing. I like traditional publishing because I can hand off something to an agent to seek me out a publisher, and then to a publisher to find me a great cover designer and a great copy editor and all of these things. And as a self-publishing person, you kind of have to either do all of those jobs yourself, or find somebody who can do all of those jobs for money, which is very expensive. And not only that, you're held to a higher standard. Your book has to look exactly the same as it would if it were traditionally published. So you really have to jump through all of those hoops. And so I applaud anybody who has the stamina, and of course, marketing people, to do all of that and sell the book. And so that's amazing. I will, from the traditional publishing side, give you one caveat about self-publishing. Self-publishing is always on the table. Like I said to you, I do a bunch of freelance editing, and I had this one amazing client recently. He was a young man who actually joined the armed forces in order to get enough money to pursue writing, which I just thought was stunning. And he wrote this book, and it was a military science fiction, which is by no means my wheelhouse. But he sent it to me as a freelance editor, and it was great. It was really, really good. And I said to him, I think a major publisher, something like Tor, might really look at this. And I think you've got a great thing here. And he said, well, it took me so long to write this, and I just really want to get it out there. And I said, well, think about it, do whatever is right for your journey, but, you've got options. And he ended up self-publishing it, which he did a great job, and the book looks great and the cover looks great. But he came back to me about 6 months later and said, I think you might have been right, and I think I should have tried Tor. And I said, unfortunately, it's too late now. Because, like I said, the self-publishing journey is always on the table, but there's 1 in a million chance that you can work backward. So if you self-publish and then say, oh, I should have traditionally published, or I should have tried that route, you can always try that route first and then self-publish. I always say, give yourself a time period or a number of people. I'm going to send it out to 10 agents. I'm going to query for 6 months. And then if that doesn't work out, you always have self-publishing on the table. Like I said, I think it's a journey I couldn't take because it just involves so much. And so I applaud everybody for it, but do realize that you kind of can't go the opposite way. In any case, we're talking about a relaunch and an audiobook. And by the way, audiobooks are I have to say, probably the gaining in popularity is an understatement. My publishing house moves a lot of audiobooks, and most of my titles are acquired by major audiobook companies, and it's growing in popularity wonderfully and ridiculously. So it's certainly a great way to promote your stuff and to have one. And I think it's a great idea to use the opportunity, the audiobook launch as a relaunch. So I think, pursuing avenues that you didn't the first time around when you're relaunching a title. And particularly because there are certain blogs and reviewers and that sort of thing who do audiobooks only. So you probably missed them the first time around anyway. Also, giveaways are amazing for that sort of thing. So, the more giveaways you can do, here's 3, free titles, whatever it is, 3 people can win this. So I think doing a relaunch with the audiobook is a really great idea. And targeting those people who it's actually quite a different market. There aren't, the print market and the audiobook market sometimes, but kind of infrequently overlap. So I think you've got a really great potential for hitting those demographics. Okay, so next question. Do I feel that Iowa Writers Workshop is a good path to publish in the fiction arena, or what are some courses that I might attend as my time currency is limited? Pipeline has been great. Yes, so I think, I don't know. I mean, there are wonderful programs, there are expensive programs, and there's everything in between. Like you say, Pipeline certainly has a bunch of, they're going to be doing more of these symposiums or symposia, if we prefer. They have the town halls, all of these, and even like the weekly chats, like I said, are really informative and wonderful. I think if you write in a genre, I would suggest joining a group that's in that genre. Like, for example, Sisters in Crime, which is an organization that I belong to that specializes in mystery, thriller, suspense. And they also have male members. So if you're a man, join Sisters in Crime too. But they do workshops and panels and things from, genre writing to marketing and everything in between. I'm also guessing that you probably, and they have national and local chapters. I'm guessing that you probably have, I don't know where you are, but you probably have writing groups in your area. And to kind of address a question that I generally get when I talk about that freelance editing part of the program, because people will say, well, how do I find a valid freelance editor? And that's one of the ways, find your local writing group, talk to people who might have used them, get good recommendations. This is a really valid way and a really great way of, figuring out if a person is right for you. Unfortunately, again, going back to these, there's no degree, there's no well, there's obviously an MFA or a degree in writing, but you don't require, you're not required to have one. There's nothing that an agent has to do. There's no test to pass in order to be an agent. So basically, anybody, I could decide to be an agent tomorrow. That would be a very bad idea for anyone who would be my client. But joining an organization like that, like Sisters in Crime or your local writing group, you can talk to people, because I can guarantee, when you get a offer from an agent, you want to look them up. You don't want to just say yes, you want to do some research. And it's unfortunately on you to do that kind of research. So, I highly recommend local writing groups. And of course, one of the, shall we say, positive things about the pandemic is that your local writing group could be anywhere. I know that Jeannie knows Brian Young. He's written for Pipeline, and I think he's also teaching a symposium at some point, and going to be on our podcast. But in any case, he's very active in the League of Utah Writers group, and they have some wonderful workshops and that sort of thing. And I've encouraged people to join that, even though they're not local to that group, because, you know, it's whatever it is, $30 a year or something like this. And you have access to all of these professionals. Jeannie just put in the chat that Brian will indeed be leading a symposium session in March. So, but things like that. And the world is basically your oyster as far as these virtual events are concerned. So there's something out there for everybody. And do, you know, feel free to take advantage of your local things. All right, more questions. Oh, yay. I love all of you guys. Craig Johnson, I assume not the author of Longmire, asks a couple of questions. What is the standard cost for freelance editor? And how long should you seek an agent for before you decide to self-publish? I don't know. That one's up to you. I mean, you can hear the, you know, there are the stories that nobody ever lives up to, that like, oh, I got an agent on my first query. That rarely, if ever, happens. Or, you know, I queried for 10 years until I got my agent. The gamut is wide, and no journey is the same. So to me, I think it's basically how long can you stand it? And in a minute, I'm going to talk about building the team and finding your agent. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on doing that. But I think it's up to you. Like, you know, if you're very excited to self-publish, but you want to try traditional first, go, you know, I'm going to do this for a year. And I hesitate to say something like 6 months, simply because, and especially right now in the industry, turnaround times are ridiculous, you know, especially if you're going into a slush pile for an agent. They might, and then they're, you know, we just had holidays, et cetera, et cetera. People might be 6 months behind in their slush pile. So as a aside, which I should talk about in the next section, but I'm thinking about it now, so I'll tell you now. I highly recommend following any agents that you're interested in on Twitter, because they might, and frequently do, tweet things like, I am through, you know, my slush pile through November. And that might be the only way that you're going to know that you got to know if you submitted in October and haven't heard. Because it's very hard. Again, when we're going back to, we get 50 to 500 of these a day, you can't answer everybody. So I highly recommend that. And we'll talk a little bit more about interacting with agents in the next section, which I probably might get to. Craig's other question about the standard cost for freelance editor, that's another moving target. You're probably talking anywhere, generally a freelance editor worth their salt charges by the word and not by the page. So I'm going to say that it could be anywhere from 2 cents to 8 cents a word on a freelance edit. And it's just going to depend on, you know, how much experience they have, how backed up they are, that sort of thing. So that would be my very vague response to that one. The next question, if one has a self-published book, how does one find a traditional publisher to launch it, either with new packaging or options for audio, etc.? So that's really tough, because it rarely, I mean, there are publishers who do it. There aren't many. You're going to be looking at a very, very small percentage of publishers who will traditionally publish a book after it's been self-published. Like, for example, and again, skipping kind of to the query letter part, I get a lot of questions about, well, I self-published a book, should I include that in my query letter? And I generally say, you know, unless you got more than, you know, 10,000 copies moved, it's really not a bonus for a traditional publisher or an agent to see that. So it's just a matter of finding, and they're going to be smaller presses normally, who will consider relaunching. And also, again, it might depend, you know, you kind of have, again, a scale. Either if you've sold 10,000 copies or more, a traditional publisher might want it and might repackage it. Or if you've sold basically no copies, because the thing is, and I see this a lot because I get approached, I work for a smaller publisher, um, and I get approached by people who have the fourth book in a series or something like that. And it's a great series. And they say, okay, I've got a fourth book. Would you like to publish it? And I always say no. Because the thing is, we're small and mighty. We're great. But if you had a big five publisher publish those first 3 books, and you had a huge marketing team and a huge budget behind that, there's nothing that I can add to the game at this point to possibly, get a new reader. So basically, I would rather, if that same author came to me with a new series, I'd be thrilled because they're going to bring in their built-in audience and I can do new things for a new series. But just kind of like a self-published book, it's already been out there. And so the publisher is going to ask themselves, what more can I bring to the table to a product that's already been put in the marketplace? So you kind of have to think of it like that. And kind of follows up on her audiobook question with, how do I find an agent for the audiobook market? Well, generally kind of if you have a traditional, literary agent, they often also cover audio. I don't honestly know if there is I have not encountered a specific audiobook agent that only does that. I do, for example, Polis Books, which is Agora is the imprint that I work for, but Polis Books, we have foreign rights agents, and they also cover audiobooks. So I will send them information on my upcoming titles, and they will take them to things like the Frankfurt Book Fair, the London Book Fair, etc., and also reach out to things like Blackstone and Audible and Orange Sky and all of these great audio people and pitch them that. So generally, I don't know that there's audio only agents, but it's possible because I think a lot of general agents and foreign rights agents have that under their umbrella. Okay, so no open questions. Yay, I feel like I just leveled up. We will now move on to the agent part of your career. So again, like I said before, your agent is part of your team. So you want to find somebody that's going to be the most passionate advocate for you. And the reason that I think agents are good, despite so many bad stories that you hear about them, they come with a built-in set of contacts and doors they can open that you couldn't do on your own. In addition to doing things like negotiating contracts, they also, which is part of why I love my agent, they get to be the bad guy. For example, if your publisher sends a cover that you just hate, or your publisher, turns over an edit to you that just doesn't work, rather than you burning the bridge with that publisher or with that editor at the publishing house, you can go to your agent and go, I don't like this. And they can be, again, your bulldog in that case, as they were your advocate in getting that deal to begin with. So agents do, they wear a lot of hats and have connections because they've worked in the industry, hopefully, for a while. And for example, I take unsolicited, unagented submissions. So that means that you cannot have an agent and submit a manuscript to me. That being said, I have a handful of agents that I know if they send me a submission, I'm going to read it right away because they have great taste. I've worked with their clients before and their clients are great. Things like that. So it can get you to the top of the pile to get the right agent. Now, quickly, as far as how do you find an agent, that's harder. Like I said, again, highly recommend doing in-person pitching if you possibly can. But if you're going to query, and of course, please do your research. Google these people at the very least, because Again, no degree to be an agent, no schooling necessary. And sometimes, I have heard stories about these unscrupulous agents, but the thing is that information is generally out there. So whether you ask an organization that you belong to, SIFWA, if you're science fiction or fantasy, Horror Writers of America, Romance Writers of America, Sisters in Crime, all of these organizations, there will be a member who knows a story, whether it's good or bad about that agent, and I highly recommend that you seek it out. But finding them, it's better. I've had, when I was teaching the MFA class a couple of weeks ago, I had somebody who was very frustrated in finding an agent because they bought that, that directory of agents and editors and just went by genre and submitted willy-nilly across the board. And that's fine, but it's really not working to your best possible chance to get an agent. What I suggest that you would do is find 5 to 10 books that you feel are similar to yours. Think of the old Amazon, if somebody who bought this also bought that. And then find out who those authors' agents are. Now, Googling that generally works. But if all else fails, open the book to the acknowledgements, because authors always thank their agents in the acknowledgements. So figure out those 5 to 10 top agents that have represented books similar to yours. And guess what? You've got a better chance then, because again, what did I say? At the end of the day, we're all readers. And what are agents acquiring? Books they want to read. What are editors at publishing houses acquiring? Books they want to see on the shelves and want to read. And what are we writing as writers? Books we want to read. So if, chances are, if an agent liked that book, they might also like yours. So that's kind of how to whittle down that field. And saying something in your query letter, like, I very much like works by X author name, and it would be really an honor to be considered by, the agent who represents them. That gets you a little bit further in your query letter, because you've clearly done your homework, which is always nice. And I'm going to give a super, super brief submission package lesson, because I have, between all of my jobs through the years, seen enough query letters that I have kind of figured out a formula where, if you Google a successful query letter, they're going to be all over the board. But again, what do we want? We don't really want to stand out in a negative way. And we definitely also don't really want to stand out. You're not reinventing the wheel in a query letter or a synopsis. It is a delivery system for information. The place that you want to stand out is in your first, 3 chapters, 50 pages with your book, not the query letter and not the synopsis. So here's my standard format for a query letter that will not get you kicked out of the pile immediately. So in the first paragraph, I suggest that you have, of course, whatever introduction. If, like I said, if you looked up that agent and said, I'd be thrilled, I know you represent X person, love their books, whatever it is, then introduce yourself, have your title, have your genre, have your word count, whether or not it's a series, this is book 1 in a proposed trilogy, whatever it is. And if it's not, don't say that. And then your little tagline. So that one line that's going to, really encourage somebody to read on. Then your paragraphs 2 and 3 are going to be what I call the mini synopsis. So you're telling the story. It's going to be that black back cover blurb that we were talking about in the bookstore. So basically what you'd see on the back of the book. You're going to name only, your main characters, and everybody else is going to be named as a result. This is a book about John, and this is John's mother, John's girlfriend, John's whatever. You don't want to include too many names. Make sure you follow the plot points and the emotional arc of the character, and don't go into any side plots. My basic, I know it's really hard to write a mini synopsis, let alone a full synopsis. It's the hardest thing, I think, for a writer to write. And so I think my best trick for that is to pretend that you were up all night reading your own book and you loved it, and you meet a friend for coffee in the morning and they say, well, you know, you look tired, what's wrong? And you say, I just was up all night reading the best book. And they say, what's it about? I want you to write down that what's it about, because the key to a good mini synopsis in the query letter or a full synopsis is that people, writers, focus too much on the facts and the linear nature of the story and don't actually tell the story in a narrative, engaging way. So if you're thinking that, you know, you just read, imagine a different book that you read that you know well. And what would you tell your friend about that book? What would you leave out? You're probably not going to tell everybody's name. You're not going to tell all of those side notes. You're not going to. So, you know, keeping it engaging and short is key. Then your last paragraph of the query letter is what I call the about you paragraph. So there should be only 3 things in it. And if none of these apply to you, that's also okay. I consider the about you paragraph to be a value add paragraph. Like, I'm going to buy your book based on, well, your book, who you are and what you do. Is going to be a value add that I can market if necessary. But if that's not going to make or break me buying your book, because again, I'm buying your book based on your words. So 3 things can go in that about me paragraph. 1, what makes you a career or professional writer? So, you know, you have the MFA. You've written nonfiction books, and this is fiction. You were a journalist, something that goes to show me that you might have been edited before, you might work to a deadline, anything like that, even if it's not, you know, clearly relevant to your current work, anything like that. Or, you know, you are president of your local Sisters in Crime chapter, something that's showing me that you are dedicated to the profession of writing. Second thing is anything that makes you an expert on what you've written. You wrote a book about a serial killer, you happen to be a serial killer. You know, your protagonist is a spy, your father worked for the CIA. Your book takes place in Spain, you lived in Spain for 5 years. Something that goes to anything in your book that makes you an expert. The last thing is anything that makes you independently marketable. So, you know, if you're going to go on a talk show or I get an interview for you, they would have probably interviewed you anyway, even if you didn't have a new book out. You know, you won a gold medal in the Olympics, you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with Johnny Cash, something that you could talk about that's interesting. So those are the 3 things that should be in that about me paragraph. And again, like I said, if you don't have any of those things, don't feel bad. This is a value add paragraph. And that's your query letter. And also, I want to skip back for just 1 second to that first paragraph and tell you why I want that stuff in the beginning. Like I said, agents, editors, we get 50, 500 of these a day. And I want to know upfront things like your genre and your word count, because I kid you not, queries, you know, for example, as Jeannie said in my introduction, I specialize through my imprint in crime fiction and horror. If you send me a romance, I'm going to have to pass because I don't have that ability to publish that. You know, if you send me a crime fiction that's 400,000 words, I also can't publish that. That's way beyond a standard word count. I want to know if you put that up front for me, then I can pass immediately, as opposed to wasting my time and reading the entire query. I also think it's really good because you're priming your audience, especially with the genre and your title, about what's coming. I still remember, and I wish I could remember the woman's name who pitched me, but I got this pitch forever ago. And it sounded like a standard, like chick lit book. It was like, young girl is stuck in a dead end job that she hates. she's single, she's lonely, she kind of has a crush on her neighbor, but doesn't get up the courage to talk to him. Will she do it tonight? I don't know, maybe, maybe not. She calls her mom instead, but her mom's not home. So she like pours a glass of wine and she's going to watch TV. And then the alien walked down the staircase. And I stopped dead. She kept talking. She was telling me the rest of the story. And to this day, I have no idea what the rest of that book was about because I stopped dead at the alien. I was not expecting the alien. But if you said in your first paragraph, this is a sci-fi, comedy or sci-fi romance, when you say alien, I'm not going to stop dead because I'm primed in advance to hear something odd. So that's another reason why you want that in the first paragraph. And also, because as I was saying, you're much better to pitch in person, if at all possible, than on the page. That's also, if you've written this query letter, that's your in-person pitch. I want you to sit down and I want you to say, I am so-and-so. I have written this book that has this title. It's this genre. It's this word count. Here's my one, sentence teaser. And then here's a little bit about what the book's about. And here's a little bit about me. So it does double duty in that way. So I think that's basically our section on, agents. Oh, and one thing that I do want to say, and this is just a personal pet peeve of mine, which, considering that I can't see any of you, so I don't have that like interaction as to whether or not you're nodding off or engaged or anything. I'm just going to use this as my personal soapbox. And one of my personal pet peeves is when I have an author say to me, in any iteration of this, I'm scared to ask my agent this question. I don't want to bother them again. I emailed them a month ago and didn't hear, and I just, I don't want them to fire me. Remember that all of these people on your team, in a way, well, especially your agent, which definitely does, and if you have a freelance editor, same. These people work for you. Your agent is, as I said, it's your advocate to the publishing industry. So you want to have somebody that you can communicate well to. Again, going back to that whole, like, it's a dating thing. You want to create a relationship with somebody and you want to make sure that you have free and open communication. You want to know your career path, like, once we finished here, someday. I think I'm going to talk for about 3 more hours, but you have that handout and hopefully you'll have an idea about your career path. I want you to say that to your agent. Here's where I see myself in 5 years. How do you think I can get there? And also open communication. My agent, I have an agent. I'm on agent number 3, by the way. So, it's not always great the first time. But my agent has said to me, I have some clients who say, don't call or email me unless it's a, yes, the publisher is looking at it. Don't tell me if it's a no. And then he has other clients who will say, I have to know everything. Please give me like a weekly update of who you've gone out to. And every client is different. And if you have an agent, you should say, hey, I can be a little bit needy. I need to hear back from you. I need this. And they should go, okay. And if they say no, then that might not be the right agent for you. For example, how I got, oh goodness, I'm just going to go way over time. I can tell already. Oh no, everyone. But my first agent I lost because she was lovely, by the way. But she got an opportunity to open a literary arm of a film agency in California. So off she went to sunnier climes, and I was very happy for her. But it left me without an agent. So I thought to myself, well, where am I going to go now? So I emailed the head of the agency and said, hey, I just lost, my agent, and are you interested, or is somebody else, you think would work for me? And he emailed me back and said, I would absolutely like to take a call with you. And I can't tell you how excited I was, because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be represented by the head of the agency. Like, that is big coup, go me. And I took this call with him, and I could clearly tell, no offense to him, he hadn't read what I'd submitted. And B, he had a very salesman-y way about him that wasn't necessarily really compatible with me. And so I actually said no, and I turned him down, even though it was the head of the agency. And it probably could have been to my detriment, but I was just like, I don't really think our working styles are compatible. And I said that to him. And I said, I really hope, maybe one day we'll work together. No offense, but I just don't think we click. And the agent that I ended up with, because then I was agentless, and I asked everybody under the sun about their agent and whether they liked them, their former agents, whether they liked them. And the one that I ended up with, who I absolutely adore, was because the one author I asked said, sometimes my agent sells books and sometimes he doesn't, but he will often come to me with an idea or something that I haven't thought of trying. And I really love that he comes up with stuff and thinks out of the box. And I went, okay, this sounds like the right person for me. And it ended up being. So, having that open communication is really key because, again, this person is your representative. And you want to actually literally think about, do I want to send this person out in the world, and talk to an editor at Tor or an editor at, Penguin or something about my book? Is this the best advocate for me? So make sure you're comfortable with that person and ask them, always have a call if you don't get to meet them in person before you sign. Oh, and before I forget, one other very positive thing about those in-person pitches that is very much a value add. So a lot of major publishing houses do not accept unagented submissions. They just don't. So you have to get an agent first before you get it in front of, let's say, Penguin again. Now, there is a workaround to that. See, I'm really fond of those workarounds and those little cheats. And pitching in person is that, because a lot of these conferences that I'm talking about, like Writer's Digest or League of Utah Writers, or you name it, that anywhere that has pitching, they often bring out editors from the major publishing houses, and you don't have to have an agent to pitch them in person. So you can go pitch, let's take Tor again, in person, and they request, and then you can email or walk over to, that agent that you really wanted and say, hey, I've got a request from Tor. Would you like to represent me? And so you can kind of do a backwards workaround in that way. And it's just, added incentive to do that live pitching. All right, so before I move on to next section, let's go back to questions again. Okay. Angela says, this pandemic has offered virtual meetings and pitching sessions. When I discuss meeting live, do I mean via Zoom or actual face-to-face? I actually mean both. I've been really excited because I used to do all of the pitching things, in person prior to pandemic. And I was really excited because over the last year, some of these conferences are quite cost prohibitive, especially the ones in New York. And so there are people who want to go or want to pitch and they just can't afford to travel. And I was pitched by people in Africa, in Europe. I could not have been happier. And that was all virtual. So a lot of places are doing them hybrid now. So when I say in person, consider it virtual / live, depending on safety levels. Mileage may vary where you are. Okay, Craig, not Longmire Johnson, asks, last paragraph of the query letter, should I include the 4 songs under contract? That's an interesting question. I do think that actually kind of falls under both professional writer and an interesting thing about you. So I might not be super specific, but I might say, I have 4 songs under contract with X place, if you think they'd know what X place is. I am glad to hear that Angela is not asleep. That makes me happy. And then Kenna asks on the About You section, what about including radio, television, or communication work and scientific peer-reviewed publications? Okay, so yes to all of those things. Not only on the radio and television / communication work, that's a really good value add, because it tells me as well, whether if I was an agent, as an agent, but particularly as an editor who's going to set up events for you, that you're going to be able to speak in front of an audience. I can, not worry when I send you to do an event. That's great. And scientific peer review publications, yes. It doesn't matter if you're trying to query fiction and your only publications are nonfiction. Include that, because what it tells me is that you know the process of, like I said earlier, you've probably been edited, you've probably worked to a deadline. So all of those things are really important and goes to show that, you are a professional writer. And oh, this isn't interesting. Is it too intimate to say I am in the less than 1% of orphans who attended a university and went on to become a physician? Show my determination. Well, that's a really interesting, that's a good question, because I think it definitely goes to a value add as far as that, independently marketable. That's certainly a talking point I would use, if I were booking you on a TV show or something. I do think that I might hold it back unless it's kind of relevant to what you're querying. So I think that's my answer is maybe. It's going to depend on how you bring it up and how relevant it is to what you're doing. Okay. Dawn wants to know number of pages, and I assume on the number of pages he means query letter. So query letter should be no more than 1 page. I also think your synopsis should be no more than 1 page. Now, you can do the single spaced with an extra line between paragraphs on the synopsis, and you can do it for your query letter too if it's long. Oh, and going back, I'm actually really glad you asked that question, Dawn, because it jogged my memory of something else. When you're querying agents, please, 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 again, this goes to doing your research, look and follow very closely their guidelines. If they want a certain thing in a query letter or a certain subject in their subject line, or they only want all of these things as attachments, or they only want them in the body of the email, follow those things to the letter, and generally it's on their website, so look for it. But this is another thing, a really simple thing that can get you dinged. You could have written the best query letter and the best blah blah, and they ask for it pasted in the body of the email, and you send it as an attachment, and they're going to reject it. Again, not because of any quality violation on your part, but because they have 50 to 500 to go through, and they have to have a reason to kick it out. So be very careful. All right, now a couple more questions here. Oh, and everybody remind me, this is very helpful, speaking into a void, to go into that Twitter for a moment as well. So Paul asks, I'm planning on attending several conferences, but concerned on how many agents I will be pitching. What is a good number? Well, first of all, if you attend conferences, generally there is a added cost to pitch. So keep that in mind as well. But over and above that, only pitch people who are really right for you. Again, going back to a moment ago and doing your research, see who else they publish, make sure that they are who they work with, make sure that they deal with your genre. And the thing is, it could be the most famous agent in the world, but you've got a cookbook and they have never sold a cookbook in their life. And publishing is very niche, honestly. And part of what you want is, you think, oh, that's a huge agent, I want them. Well, you only want them if they have contacts in your genre. Because, biggest agent in the world who sells, let's say, young adult, probably doesn't have any contacts in, again, using the bad analogy, like the cookbook world. So you've got a great agent, but they're not actually going to give you any value for that because they don't know that area. So make sure that they know the area that you're working in. Do a little bit of research on what authors they represent. First of all, it just is going to show that you've done your research, and agents and editors love that. I mean, I know that I always respond if I get a query that says something like, I have read X, Y, and Z that Agora has published. And, I really appreciate that. And here's what I liked about it and why I think my book will fit in your line. I go, oh, okay. Because the number of times that I read a query and go, why on earth did this person query me? Are legion. Like I said, I'll get that like romance book and I'm like, this doesn't even make sense. I feel bad for this poor person, who can't, who probably has a great book, and they spent the time on this and is waiting for a response from me, but I'm completely the wrong person to be asking about this. So, and also going back to that in person, since we've had a couple of questions about that, I'm going to say my inaugural line, I started Agora for Polis in 2019. And my first line it was September, October, November. So we acquired 3 books for that inaugural line. And the first book, John Vercher's 3/5, I acquired through a slush pile submission. He sent me an email. He didn't have an agent. He told me about the book. And I swear to you, I knew from reading that query that I was going to publish that book and it was going to be the first book for my line. I just knew it. The second book, Patricia Smith's Remember, that's kind of a funny in-person story because I was listening to pitches. I think it was at Writer's Digest, as a matter of fact, in New York. And this lovely young woman, she couldn't have been more than 20 or 21 at the time. I didn't have a line and everybody else did. So she came and sat down and she said, you know what, I don't think I should be pitching you because I think I've written a YA book and you specialize in crime and mystery and thriller and suspense. And I said, you know what, I've got nobody in line behind you. And she was very nervous. She said, this is my first pitch. I've never done anything like this before. I said, look, nobody's in line. Why don't you give me your pitch? Because no harm, no foul. I can't acquire your book. I don't take YA. So then you'll be more comfortable for the next person. So she starts pitching me, and it's this brilliant psychological suspense book that I suppose it had a younger protagonist. She starts at about 18 and ends at about 22. But it's clearly a psychological suspense book, and I acquired it. So that was book 2. And then book 3, Tori Eldridge's The Ninja Daughter, came to me through an agented submission. So that just goes to show you that all of the paths, to getting publication or getting an agent are valid. There's no one right way to go about any of this. Okay, so that's Paul's question. And let's see. We have Angela's question. She sees herself writing short stories in a few years after publishing a few more novels and having some of her stories successfully adapted. She sees the last 2 books being remarketed. In 5 years, she sees herself as the director of a local writers group, as well as having a collection of published work for which I'm compensated. So how do I get there? Oh, good question, Angela. I wish I had a really great specific answer for you on that one. But I think having those goals are really good. And to skip ahead just a little bit, because the next part of what I was going to talk about is about a publisher and your publishing choice. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about, which apparently maybe I'm going to talk about now, who knows, apparently not me, is identifying long-term goals and also interim plans of how to make money as a writer while you're waiting to make money as a writer. Because, for example, for a debut novel, unless you have, and we'll get to this in the publishing part, you're one in the million that get that 6-figure deal or whatever. The most you're probably looking at for your first novel being published, and this is a good number, is let's say $20,000-$25,000. That's probably not going to be enough for you to quit your day job. So you're going to have to think about, how you can make money. This is why I really like Angela's question, because she's talking about like short stories and writing short, which can be, a really frustrating thing. But one good thing about writing short is that you can get paid for all of those short stories. And then eventually, once you have enough published, you can put out an anthology of that short fiction that you've worked for. You can also do freelance writing as an editor or, writing articles, that sort of thing. You can also teach, if you have the MFA, or if you have a couple of books out, or you have, you can speak in front of writing groups and get paid for it. There's also, of course, you can work if you're particularly in the like sci-fi fantasy world, or the gaming world. There's a bunch of tie-in novel opportunities or ghostwriting opportunities. So these are all ways that you can think of, and even offering your services. Sometimes you might do a few things for free, like speak at a library for free, or if you want to do some freelance editing, and you have the qualifications to do it, or the experience to do it, I should say. Doing a few of those jobs for free just to get some word of mouth, and some experience. But think of these things in the back of your mind as, ways to supplement your writing while still being a writer, because all of that is good. And that can certainly just pad your resume and that about me paragraph of your query letter. So good luck, Angela. I wish I had like I said, a very specific answer for you. It's like when people ask me how to become an editor, my degrees are not in this. And I sold art internationally, and then worked in Hollywood, and then somehow weirdly ended up in publishing, which is my dream job, and I love it passionately. But there's certainly no way that I could tell people to follow that path and you're going to become an editor. Chini, I see that. I'm trying to monitor both sides of these chats. Thank you. Don't forget about Twitter. Okay. So Twitter, I actually think, so first of all, caveat, I hate social media. If I never had to be on social media ever again, if we could go back to like carrier pigeons, and letters and all of that, I would be a happy camper. But we're not. And the one great thing I think about social media is Twitter, because Twitter to me is like a cocktail party where every person that you've ever wanted to meet, whether it's a celebrity or an agent or an editor or a publisher or pick a thing, they're all at this cocktail party. And it's up to you whether to, stand in the middle of the room and yell, buy my book, which by the way, never works, or, overhear some conversations, or, gently approach a conversation and add your 2 cents to it. But I cannot tell you how many people that I know have gotten, or at least Twitter has, oh, how shall I say this? Twitter has eased along a connection between an agent and an author, or an editor and an author. This used to happen all the time when we were doing things in person. The number of times that we'd be having like one of those pitch fests, and an author would walk up to an agent and introduce themselves, and the agent would go, oh, I know you, you're the one who always posts the picture of their cat on Friday, or whatever it was. And you've already made an in-person connection with somebody. So those things are there for the taking, and I highly recommend them. But also, it's another one of those situations where you can kind of get in front of people that you might not ever get in front of otherwise. A lot of agents do things like, okay, I'm bored tonight. I'll take 10 pitches in the next 10 minutes, something like this. So keeping an eye on Twitter and interacting in a really respectful and positive way, and creating your brand early on, all are good things, and all can help you. I think it was Michael Korda at Simon & Schuster. I'm probably wrong, but it could be. But in any case, VP of marketing, Simon & Schuster said, if he gets 2 books in that are very, very similar, I don't know, you've written two, there's a cozy cat mystery and a cozy cat mystery, And he will look at social media, and if they're, if he was having a hard time choosing between them, he'll take the person with more followers. Now, that's not saying that you have to have 1 million followers to get a book deal. But again, going back to that value add thing, it certainly doesn't hurt. I mean, I'm dealing with an author right now who wrote an absolutely brilliant book, but is very hesitant about social media. And I keep saying to her, I'm like, I know it's like pulling teeth. I know you don't like it, but I can tweet until the cows come home about a book, but nobody cares about the editor of that book. A fan wants to interact with the reader or the writer of that book, right? So it means so much more coming from the actual author. So creating a platform, which is actually one of the things on that handout, and I suggest you do it now. And I like to call, and I know that this is really kind of like inside baseball on that handout of yours, but I consider that you should have 2 social media platforms, a plot platform and an emotional platform, just like you have in your book. Your protagonist should have, the plot arc that they're following and an emotional arc that they're following. And the plot arc on your social media is going to be whatever that book's about. Again, we'll go back to, you wrote a book that takes place in Spain. So you're going to tweet about, pictures of when you lived in Spain, or paella recipes, or whatever it is about Spain that's going to, and then about writing. So anything that's about the writing and the plot of the book, or things about the book tangentially. That's your plot platform on social media. Then your emotional platform is something separate that a reader or just other people can connect with you about. You have a podcast about cosplay. You really love baseball and obscure baseball trivia, and so you're going to be like the weird baseball trivia guy on Twitter, and people are going to follow you because, hey, that's interesting too. So that's your emotional platform. So I suggest you figure out what those 2 things are, because you're going to kind of carve out that niche for yourself on social media. And you're just going to, it's going to cross-populate. People who love you as the crazy baseball trivia guy are going to come over when your book is finally published and go, oh, I really enjoy reading, his tweets. So sure, I'm going to pre-order that book. So those sort of things. And I think that is, I hope, adequately covering all of my Twitter thoughts. And thank you, Kenna, for the nice words. I'll just print that and put it above my computer. Are there any special agents for short stories? No, not really that I know of. And actually, I just went through this with one of my MFA students, because that's really his passion. And we were talking about, the best way to do that. Because he loves short stories and he wants to publish a collection of short stories. And I say, that's really, really hard to do. If you get, the unicorn of like your stories in the New Yorker or the Atlantic or Guernica or something like this, then you can probably approach a publisher and be like, I have a collection of short stories. Some of them are new, some of them have been published in these prestigious places. But it's kind of really hard path to do it. And I actually, he and I were discussing whether or not we would consider writing a novel just in order to push his short stories. So it's a good but a difficult path. Okay, anonymous attendee says, I've submitted my rom-com novel, full manuscript requested, from 5 yay to about 10 agents, 8 who got back to me within a week and rejected. I asked for feedback from several and they actually got back to me and said there was nothing wrong with it, it just wasn't for them. Should I take this as them being polite and revise my first 5 chapters, or should I continue to query agents? I'm feeling deflated and not sure about what I should do. This is a great question. And also I have to say that all of this, until your last sentence about being deflated, this is actually a very successful round of submissions. And you've done absolutely the right thing as far as asking for feedback, because one of my favorite things to say is, it's not a no until it's a no. If you can after you've queried a few agents or publishers and gotten yeses, nos, requests, etc. You can kind of tell whether it's a formulaic rejection. Hey, thanks so much. Sorry, I don't think it's right for us. Bye. That's probably a formulaic rejection. However, if you have a couple of informational points in there, like, I was really excited to read this. I love, I don't know, Gothic horror. And, but I really didn't feel connected to the protagonist, something that actually clues in that the person reading has actually read it, connected with it on some level, and then rejected it. This is actually a wonderful opportunity. Take that no and say, turn it around and say, thank you so much for giving this a clear, thorough read. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to work with you. I know you're super busy, but would you mind giving me any feedback? Can you tell me why you didn't connect with the protagonist or something that I could do? And here's the key point to that. If it's somebody that you actually want to work with, then ask, would you be up for a R&R, which is a revise and resubmit? And I have said yes to this multiple times, where I've been really excited to read a book and it just doesn't seem quite there. And it's not quite there to the point where it's too much heavy lifting for me. Like I will acquire a book where I go, oh, this needs a few changes. I'm happy to work with the author. I see great potential. But if I feel like it's more first draft stage, and it's going to involve a lot of work for me to get it there, then I'm going to say, hey, look, here are some problems that I had with it. If you want to revise it and resubmit it to me, I'll absolutely read it again. So that no, I consider a series of 2 opportunities. First, like you already did, ask for feedback, see if they'll give it to you. They might not. But yes, if they give you that feedback, then I suggest if it's valid feedback, not all it's great to ask for it. You don't have to listen to it if it's, anathema to, the ethos of your book as it is. But if it's valid feedback, yes, absolutely, I would consider revising according to that. And then ask again, your second opportunity is, can I revise and resubmit based on these things? So I highly recommend that you do both of those. The fact that you've gotten a full requests from 5, 8 who got back to you. I can't tell you the number of people that I talk to every day who's like, I never heard from these agents. So getting 8 out of 10 actually getting back to you is a wonderful number. 5 out of 10 requesting full. I think this is a really high level of success. And so I don't think you should take it as them being polite, because if they're saying, there's nothing wrong with it, it just wasn't for them. That's exactly what I'm talking about. These are good no's. These are, oh, okay, I'm doing the right thing, but I've just, I'm dating the wrong people. I've got to send that query to, 10 more, and hopefully one of them is going to be the one. But rather than thinking of it as a no and a rejection, they're not rejecting you. There's nothing wrong with it. They weren't passionate about it. And you want that person who's passionate about it. So I suggest, anonymous attendee, that you go back to the drawing board and find 10 more agents, and keep doing what you're doing, because clearly you have a great query that's getting, attention. And you just have to find, Mr. or Ms. Right here. So keep at it. All right. Next question. After over 3 decades as a florist, I consider myself having an MFA from experience, though I do not have an MFA certificate. So how can I teach writing classes? Is being an author a good enough credential to teach at a college level or speak at conferences for payment? Yes, absolutely. We can actually go back to, since Jeannie and I were, well, she in the chat and me live, we're talking about him earlier, Brian Young, who's teaching the Symposium class in March. He teaches clearly here, but he also teaches at whatever the local university is to him. He does not have an MFA, and does not have a college level writing degree. So absolutely, if you have experience, if you've written books, you can talk. And, you know, a lot of organizations, you know, if you're talking about, you know, there's, like Gotham Writers Club, Lit Reactor that I've taught for, they want writers to talk about writing. You know, conferences hire generally and pay people to, you know, come in virtually or in person and talk about writing. So the fact that you've written qualifies you to talk about writing. And also just as one of those platform things, you know, figuring out marketing wise, you can also talk about things that you've learned while writing your book. You know, if you had to research Spain or serial killers or something, you know, make sure that you're thinking about these platforms. You can appear on blogs, podcasts, in front of local groups who are, you know, talk about Spain or serial killers or whatever it is that you did that research on. Just because you've written a book doesn't mean that you only have to talk about writing. So, you know, keep that in mind as well. All right, let's see. Let's see, could I just give the overview of this question to the audience without specifics? Okay, hold please while I read. Don is asking about his genre. Okay, and actually, you know what, it's a really good question, Don. I'm glad you asked this one too, because it's a question that I get a lot because genre is hard. And one of the things that I have on that list is, you know, do you know your genre? And clearly that's going in your query letter. Clearly that's going to how you're marketing something. So genre is very important. And I still remember a horror story where I was teaching a class and I asked, you know, I was talking about genre and I asked, you know, please, you know, tell me what your genre is. And this woman kept coming up with these most obscure, like 18th century, you know, female sleuths who are haberdashers. Like, and I'm like, that's not a genre. And she would like narrow it down in another weird, very specific way. And I'm like, that's not a genre. And I said, you know, you pretend you're walking in a bookstore. What shelf is your book on? And again, I get this very specific response. I finally figure out that she was using the Amazon categories, because if you look at the bottom of an Amazon listing, you know, it'll have the big, you know, the basic genre like fiction, and then like, you know, mystery, and then, you know, it breaks it down and down and down. You need to know what shelf your book is on, because marketing, like I said, to these readers, it's very different from genre to genre to genre. And it's also very difficult sometimes to diagnose when your book has several genres. You know, you've got there's clearly a crime in your book, but also a big focus is, you know, the romance between the protagonist and, you know, her soon to be significant other. And which one is it? Is it romance or is it mystery? So I have kind of two suggestions on this front. First of all, figure out, you know, if you were outlining the plot, which is the thing you're going to say first? Is it, you know, there's a crime that needs to be solved, you know, X stumbles across a dead body, or is it that, you know, X falls in love with this guy, will they or won't they? So, you know, that can kind of answer your question in asking, you know, that to yourself. But the other thing is, and this goes back to our point on agents, you know, sure, tailor it to your audience. You can query with something like that. You can query agents who specialize in crime fiction, and you can query agents who specialize in romance, and kind of flip your query letter around based on who you're marketing this to. You know, and put the crime forward in the one to the crime agents and the romance one forward into the query for romance agents. And of course, sometimes, you know, if you're lucky, and this is, I realize I'm really getting short on time. And this is something that I want you to think about as you're doing your career path and filling out that form. You know, I know people who think, well, you know, my first book was crime fiction, but I really want to write, you know, I have a great idea for a historical. I have a great idea for a fantasy. I have a great idea for a, I want you to know this in advance because, like I said, agents and publishers generally specialize. And so, often you'll find an agent who does, both. We'll go with my earlier example, romance and crime. They specialize in both and have experience in both. So you're going to be fine, and you're not going to need another agent to represent you if you've got, something else going on. But it's something that you want to know so that you can look for somebody who specializes in all of the things that you want to write, because you don't have to stick to just one thing. And so I'm going to kind of loop back around. I have no idea how I've mentally made this connection, but I managed to, and go from that genre discussion back for a moment to the discussion that I wanted to have with you about publishers and knowing where you want to go. I really think that you should have a list of 5 or 10 publishers that you think are right for your first book, the one that you're finished or just finished now. And then I think, you want to have, and I think it's a really good idea. First of all, I don't think you should query, skipping back even further for a moment. I don't think you should query an agent until you know what you're writing next. And this has a lot of reasons, but mostly because, for example, in that question that I answered a few minutes ago, where you were getting these really good, like, there's nothing wrong with your novel, it's just not right for me. These agents might actually be right for you. They clearly read your book. And so I might, when I, had those other 2 no opportunity questions, the first being, great, I really appreciate you reading it. Can you give me any specific feedback so I can make it better? The second no question being, hey, if I revised and resubmitted, would you be willing to look at it? And the third no question that I forgot to mention at the time is, hey, this is what I'm working on / my other book that I've just finished. Would you be willing to look at it? Because if it's somebody who really liked your writing but didn't connect with that, they might be connecting with you, but that just wasn't quite the right book. And I can't tell you the number of times that last question is going to get a yes. And so you're going to need to have a synopsis. You're going to need to have something, especially definitely if it's a series. But also, even as an acquiring editor for a publishing house, it's a question I ask every author that I'm considering acquiring. What are you working on next? I don't want to acquire you for 1 book. I ideally want to acquire you for 2, and then hopefully work from there on and on and on. I'm very scared of, for what I would, lack of better term, be a one-hit wonder. I want somebody who's going to be working for a while and grow their craft, and the next book should be your best book. So I really want to know what you've got going on, whether it's a standalone, whether it's in the same genre, whether it's part of a series. I think you need at least an idea of where you're going next before you start querying. And not just so that you can ask an agent, hey, would you mind looking at something else? But so going back again to publishing, there's a lot of paths. I mean, there's as many paths out there as there are writers. So none of them's right, none of them's wrong. But I really want to emphasize that, this is one of those businesses that just seems so like gatekeepy and magical, kind of like Hollywood and film. And it's really quite pedestrian, and it's really not that exciting. I mean, I find it terrifically exciting, but I'm rather boring as a human. So, but it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know until it comes and slaps you in the face, which is also one of the reasons why you want an agent, so that they can answer these questions or ask them for you. But I strongly believe that you're going to be a better writer and a more successful career writer if you know the right questions to ask to a publisher. The number of times where I've had somebody come to me and go, oh, I was thrilled, I got a book deal, and then I went into a bookstore and, my book wasn't there, and I didn't realize that it was going to be only an ebook or print on demand, or my publisher doesn't have distribution, which is how books get in bookstores. So if your publisher doesn't have a distribution deal, you or your publisher are going to have to call every independent bookstore and try to hand sell that book. So there's a lot of questions. How much marketing are you going to have to do with a publisher? If you're with, a major publisher, it might be less than, I just reviewed a contract for a friend today that specified in it that publicity would be 50-50 between the publisher and the author. If that's not something that you can do, you probably don't want to be with that publisher. So there's a lot of methods out there, and you need to know what would work for you and what wouldn't. And one of my other really big caveats on this, or an example that I like to give, is my friend Rob Hart. He was with Polis Books, which is actually how I met him even before I started Agora. And he wrote a crime fiction PI series, the Ash McKenna series, and there were, I think, 5 books in that. And they were two, decent acclaim for a small publisher. Won a bunch of awards or were nominated for them. And he finished out the series. And at that point, he also left his agent. And he said, I really want to jump up the ladder now. I figured out how this writing business works. I figured out how editing works. I figured out a little bit of marketing stuff. And now I think it's time for me to make my big move. And he wrote a speculative fiction book called The Warehouse. And he got a new agent who happens to be my agent as well. And it went to Crown in a 6-figure deal. And then it was acquired by Ron Howard for film. And I see so many people who are more successful in that path, in a way, where they kind of put in their time, they figure out the business, they can work a little bit more hands-on with a smaller publisher before they go, okay, now it's time to make my big move. I see so many people who get that unicorn of the big first deal, that 6-figure deal or whatever, with a big publisher. And since they're brand new, there is so much stress and pressure on them because they have to earn out, which means that, the publisher expects them to sell as many books as is going to make up that 6-figure advance. That's a lot of books. That's a lot of books for somebody who has never sold a book before. This is the first time they've never done any marketing for themselves. They don't have a built-in fan base. They have a lot of pressure to sell that many books. And so often it doesn't work simply because it has nothing to do with the book, but simply because they didn't, there wasn't enough traction on it. It might have been the right time, or wrong time, bad timing as far as the release date, something happened with marketing that didn't work, whatever it is. But then they get to book 2 and, they're probably not going to get as large of an advance. And they're also probably going to get shuffled to the bottom of the marketing pile at that big 5 publishing house because they're not going to spend a lot of time on somebody who didn't earn out. So there can be a lot of pressure with that kind of big first deal. And I'm never, ever saying, don't get me wrong, that you should turn down if somebody approaches you with 6 figures, by all means, please take it. But also know what that sort of thing entails and that there's a lot of paths to get to, in getting there. And that all of these are, rungs on the ladder that you're going to climb with each book and get better. And like I said, with Rob's example, I know a lot of people who started with one agent and then realized that they outgrew them, and needed somebody who had bigger contacts or, and that happens and that's okay. Or started with a smaller publisher and goes, I think I can really jump up now. I think I can get the attention of a big 5 publisher, and moves from there. So figuring out, where you want to be, what you think would be best for you starting out, make a list of those ideal 5 or 10 publishers. And it also helps your agent, when you're having that discussion about, here's where I want to see my career go. I think my first book would be great with, X, Y, or Z publisher. I think it's part of a series, but what I plan on doing, once that series is done, is I'd like to pivot to, historical fiction. And I think, I'd like to go here, there, or the other place. And so having that mapped out is really helpful in making these decisions and knowing who's going to be right for you and knowing what questions to ask. All right, so I think we have 15 minutes left, basically. And those are my major bullet points. So I'd love to take, I know I have been throughout, but any questions in the last few minutes of this would be lovely, that I could either expand on what I've talked about or answer anything more for you guys. Oh, and I have a question from Craig. He's completed an 84,000 word YA soft sci-fi thriller. It's the first of a possible trilogy. Is it best to write the second book in the trilogy before getting an agent for the first book, or write a different book? Okay. I think you should write a different book, but you want to have a synopsis of book 2, because if you're currently querying book 1, like I said, an editor, an agent is going to try to sell it to an editor at a publishing house, and they're going to say, hey, what's book 2 about? And having a synopsis is great. However, I do think writing a completely separate book while you're waiting on selling that first one is great, because, no offense, I'm sure this is going to sell. It's going to be huge. I can't wait to read it. But I think that, you can always fall back, like I was answering the other question, and say, hey, I know you didn't love X agent person, but you might love Y, and it's got to be something, completely different and not book 2 in the series, because you can't bank, unfortunately, on that book 1 getting bought. So having a second book in the pipeline, so to speak, is a great plan. But again, like I will ask, if I'm acquiring, let's hope you get this agent. And if you're trying to sell me book 1, I'm going to ask, hey, can you give me a synopsis of book 2? Because I would rather, if it's going to be a series, make a deal for 2 books than I would for just 1. And I want to make sure also, if it is something like a trilogy, that you're going to follow through with it, and it's not going to be like the alien who came down the staircase suddenly in book 2. Great. And Kenna, who I see is now leaving, I'm going to answer her question anyway. She asks, is it better to write the book or the screenplay first? Book, always book. And here's why. You have, it is, and Jeannie can probably attest to this a million times, it is actually considerably easier to get a book bought than sell a screenplay in Hollywood. It's really difficult to do that. And you have a million times better chance of somebody in Hollywood seeing your book and wanting to adapt it for screen than you are the other way around. It's also, it's just, you're also reducing your possible revenue streams. So always book first. And the other thing is that, clearly I think some works are better for the screen, and some writers are better screenwriters. So if you really feel, so all of that stuff that I just said, you can throw out the window. If you really feel that your book or your story is a screenplay, then write the screenplay, go where your passion lies. But as far as, is it better to write the book or the screenplay first? It's always better to write the book first.
I'm just going to hop in here.
Yay.
Because I do feel like that's the chicken or the egg question. And one thing, if you are more comfortable screenwriting, the screenplay makes a great outline for your book.
That's true.
But I'm a huge believer in, even if you write the script first, go write the book, because then you're going to learn more about your characters, plot things are going to change or whatever, but at least you have a draft of the screenplay for adaptation. And if somebody wants to buy the film rights to your book, you already have a draft of the screenplay.
Exactly.
So when you have the skill set to do both, I'm personally a big fan of that.
Wonderful advice, Jeannie. Was there anything else? Was there anything else that I needed to talk about or forgot?
Oh, one thing I wanted to have you address, because this is a common question I hear authors ask, is if I get an advance and I don't sell out, and the advance Do I have to pay the money back?
No, you don't have to
I
pay the
wanna know
money
that.
back. But like I said, it's just going to ding you going forward.
Mm.
Because, you know, whether or not you have, you know, a second book deal or just an option for another book, they're going to go, well, they didn't earn out. So basically they lost money on you. Because what a publisher is hoping to do is I'm going to give you an advance and I'm expecting that you're going to earn that and more off of your book because this is going to be a really great book. So, you know, if you don't earn that out, then you're a losing money proposition. And so why would we think that book 2 is going to do better, or why would I put, you know, money behind you in another book? So yeah, it can be, I mean, it's great to get the money, but it can be a catch-22. And actually, you know, Jeannie, I'm glad that you said that because it reminds me of another story. And this kind of goes to the publication arm of the career path that I was just finishing up talking about. I know somebody recently who got 2 six-figure offers for a book, and it's a great book. I offered on it, but I don't have that kind of money through my publishing house, so I could not compete. But it's a brilliant book and got 2 competing offers, and I'm really, really happy for her. But I was talking with a friend about this, and the offers were big, big offers, and they were a matter of a few $1,000s apart. Like at that point, when you're talking big money, it's the same after a certain point. Like if you have, say, $1 million or $1,010,000, it's the same amount of money, right? Like it's so big, it doesn't matter. And the offers were the lower offer was from a editor at a publishing house who had been in the past extremely successful with that genre of book. The other offer, the higher offer, was from a publisher who rarely, if ever, publishes that genre of book, but thought that this would be a great, you know, entree into the genre. And I was talking to a couple of friends, and we all said, we think we'd go with the lower offer because you want to set yourself up for the likelihood of earning out. And if that publisher has already proven successful track record in that genre, you're more likely they know where to market it, they know what to do with the book. Whereas the other one, yes, it was more money, but you're less likely to earn out with a publisher and an editor who is not used to that genre. So these are the things that you want to think about. Like you want to think about, okay, I got a really great offer, but how likely am I to earn out in this scenario? So, you know, that's something that you want to think about. Okay, we've got a couple of questions from Angela. How do I sell an adaptation of my novel? Is it better to sell the rights or sell a workable script? Generally, you're going to sell, well, your agent, you will probably have a literary agent who has either also does film or has a film agent in the agency offices, and they will try to sell your novel to Hollywood, and they will generally sell that. And you can certainly try to negotiate in, hey, I've got a first, like Jeannie said, I've got a first draft of the script. You know, I'd love to get that in front of the producers, and you can try to negotiate that in. But that's basically how it's done. Any further thoughts on that, Jeannie, since you are
No further thoughts. I do love going to the New York Rights Fair. I really miss that. I want to go back to it this year. And then when I come, if they have it in May, I'll write an article for Pipeline Artists all about acquiring rights and all that stuff, because it's a really interesting topic. There's somebody, Angela also asked about self-published authors and selling screen rights. Like if they're self-published, they probably don't have an agent, but if someone was interested in buying the screen rights, they could, I'm sure an agent would be happy to represent
It's
them.
exactly like what I was saying with the, hey, I got a request at a pitch fest from Tor. And you can turn around and email that agent that's your dream agent and be like, I've got a request from Tor. I'd love somebody to, you know, represent me and send this out. So same thing would go there. You can do it kind of backwards. Hey, I've got an ask from, I don't know, Lionsgate. and, hey, agent, would you mind sending that out for me? So yes, it can work the other way around. And sometimes that's a better way to do it. It's almost in some cases easier to get the attention of a publisher than it is in many cases an agent. So you can kind of, work the situation backward.
Well, this has been fabulous. We've answered all the questions. You've answered all the
I'm
questions.
going to click done so that it's clear
Done.
and
No
pretty.
questions. You can level up. And I can't thank you enough, Chantelle. And I just want to point out to the people who are still here, which is great. I'm so glad you guys got a lot out of this, a lot of great comments. And I just
all the questions were wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to point out we had a last minute symposium that we're going to be doing on Monday, and it's free.
Ooh.
It's a conversation that I'm going to have with Lane Schefter Bishop. Do you know her, Chantelle?
I do not. She's
lovely. I met her at another conference that I was at in DC. This is why I love conferences, because you can get to meet a lot of people. But Lane, CNN dubbed her the book whisperer. And she basically, what she does, it's a free session that we're having. It's just going to be me and Lane having a conversation. We're doing a new one-on-one series. And Lane she knows a ton of agents in the literary world, and she will acquire the film rights to a book before it's even finished, so that she then can chime in with development notes on the book, and then she adapts them and has them on the screen, sometimes as movies. And she's also got a TV show in the works in development at NBC. She's a director, really fun woman.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
You will love her, and she's definitely one of those people she will probably have a glass of wine in her hand, as will I. We're going to have a Dick Cavett chill conversation, but everybody can still chime in with questions. So I don't know if you guys know, but if you go to the Pipeline Artists website, Symposium now has a website. So if you click on Learn, it'll take you right over to Symposium, or you could just type in symposium.pipelineartist.com. And then we have another publishing symposium coming up on February 3rd with Isabel Sterling. And she's a published author. She's a writing coach. She's actually a life coach. And she is going to talk about querying with confidence, a survival guide for the emotional roller coaster of publishing. So that'll be a nice follow-up to what Chantelle has just presented for us. So that's on February 3rd. And you can find all these things on Pipeline Artists on the Learn tab. So I'm glad you guys were all here, and I'm gonna shut this thing down and go have a glass of wine.
I do want to encourage everybody to listen to Words of Prey, the podcast, fabulous podcast by Pipeline Artists, because we do have guests every so often who are writers, and we talk about various methods of approaching this crazy writing journey. So consider it a, monthly continuation of the talk that I just gave.
Yes, there's actually, and I'm gonna, when Ruth and I send out the email, if for some reason you do not get an email from us within the next week, email symposium@pipelineartist.com, because sometimes Zoom will collect a name, but not the email address. We get 99% of the email addresses we get, but every once in a while, there's a couple that are missing. So if you don't get it, just ping us and we'll make sure that you get it. And so that was one thing. Was there anything else?
Wine. It was wine. Jeannie.
It was wine. That's probably what got me distracted. Okay, so thank you, everybody. And if you have any ideas or anything you want us to touch on, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Words of Prey. Pipelineartist.com, on the tabs, there's a listen tab. If you click on listen, it takes you to all of our podcasts, and you can find the link to the one that Chantelle did with both Brian Young and another one that she did with Rob Hart. So, and I'll put the links in the follow-up email too.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have been the first and hopefully the worst. I just expect everybody to be just amazing going forward.
But we're going to have you back again. So thank you so much, Chantelle, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.